He thought her silence meant safety, that her calm was mercy. But silence is a mirror and mercy is a blade. What he mistook for peace was simply her refusal to bleed where he could see it. He kept returning to her orbit, the way the wounded return to pain that knows their name, because somewhere in her distance his ego felt seen, not adored, seen, and that was unbearable. To be seen without control is the death of illusion. The ego calls that death rejection, but it is only exposure, the moment the mask meets the mirror. He had always chased the echo of himself in women, faces that admired, tones that soothed, eyes that forgave. But she did not forgive. She reflected. Her stillness carried the precision of judgment, not moral but existential. It said, "This is who you are when you think no one sees." He flinched, because the truth was not that she wounded him. It was that she refused to feed the wound he worshipped. Men like him crave the women who pierce them because they confuse chaos with aliveness. The archetype is ancient, the man who seeks the devouring mother, not to love her, but to test his gods against her fire. He mistakes her silence for distance. It is containment. He mistakes her depth for darkness. It is discernment. And still he circles the way the moth circles flame, compelled, terrified, unable to leave what threatens to unmake him. Because the ego's hunger is not for love, it is for reflection. It wants to be confirmed, not transformed, and transformation demands death. His anima, the feminine within him, has been exiled, so he hunts it in women who carry its shadow. The cold, the withdrawn, the untamed. He says he wants softness, but what he truly wants is absolution. He wants to be undone without surrendering, to taste power without earning it. That is why her silence terrifies him, because she gives him nothing to fight, only himself. You have seen that look before, the gaze that pleads for rescue but demands control. The paradox of a man who wants to be mothered, yet punished for being weak. You watch him oscillate between worship and resentment, between need and disdain. He calls it passion. It is regression, the ego collapsing under its own mythology. But you do not interrupt. You let the collapse come, because in the ruins of his projections, something truer begins to stir. The awareness that his hunger was never for you, it was for his own wholeness. The anima does not heal him through affection. It heals through confrontation. When he can no longer use her as a mirror for his image, he is forced to meet her as an archetype, not a woman, but a symbol of his forgotten interior. He resists. Of course he does. The masculine ego is trained to conquer what it fears, to control what it does not understand. But this is not a battlefield. This is an alchemical vessel. What burns here does not die, it refines. Still, his ego screams. It calls her cold, detached, manipulative, because it cannot comprehend boundaries without hostility. He sees her absence as cruelty. He does not see that absence is what births longing into awareness. There is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when the hunger shifts. When he realizes the ache is not for her body, or her love, or her approval. It is for the self he abandoned in pursuit of dominance. And that is when she becomes untouchable. Not because she withdraws, but because he finally sees her not as possession, but as portal. You know that moment. The air thickens, the silence lengthens, the illusion cracks, revealing not rejection but reflection. He stands before the archetype, the dark feminine, the mirror that does not blink, and for the first time he cannot perform. She watches without softness. Her eyes hold the clarity of winter, still, merciless, sacred. The kind of seeing that strips a man down to his archetypal bones. The wound throbs, the ego trembles, but beneath it something purer begins to breathe, humility. And in humility, the first seed of sovereignty. He will call it heartbreak. It is initiation, the breaking of the mirror he mistook for love. You do not chase what crumbles. You do not soothe what resists its own evolution. You stand in the stillness and let the hunger expose itself, because only in hunger does truth reveal what the ego hides. He thought her silence meant defeat, but silence is not surrender. It is the voice of the shadow teaching him how to see. And so he stares into her stillness, into his reflection, into the womb that taught him desire. He does not yet know the hunger was never for her. It was for the part of him that could finally hold her without trying to own her. The shadow feeds not on love but on consciousness, and in that recognition something ancient stirs, the death of illusion, the birth of truth. He began to sense it, the slow decay of his own performance. The grand gestures, the rehearsed charm, the practiced vulnerability that once earned him devotee. On now fell flat in her presence, because she did not react, and where there is no reaction, illusion dies. It is not that she withdrew her affection, it is that she stopped feeding his projection, and without projection the ego starves. He called her detached, but it was his reflection that had grown hollow. The very traits he once adored now triggered his shame. Her self-containment mocked his dependency. Her silence exposed his noise. Her composure felt like punishment. That is how the shadow reveals itself, not in rage, but in discomfort. When love no longer feels like worship, but like work. When attention becomes unbearable because it sees too much. He accused her of playing games, but the only game was his own need for validation. Every word he spoke was a bid for control. Every silence she held was an invitation to release it. He could not. His anima, unintegrated and hungry, clung to the outer feminine to complete itself. He mistook her mystery for withholding, her sovereignty for pride. But what he called resistance was simply refusal to collapse into his narrative. The ego does not know how to love without ownership. It confuses devotion with debt. It believes intimacy is earned through conquest. But she, the mirror of the inner feminine, dismantles this belief by standing unmoved. He did not understand that her stillness was not rejection. It was initiation, the kind that burns the false self in the quietest of flames. When the dark feminine appears, she does not seduce, she exposes. She unravels every illusion of power built upon the need to be desired. She turns admiration into confrontation, because her presence demands depth, not performance. He began to waver. The mask cracked under the weight of her seeing. He wanted to hate her, to make her the villain, because the ego prefers a war it can win over a mirror it cannot escape. You have seen it before, the man who turns cold when he feels small. The one who distances, not to find clarity, but to rebuild the illusion of control. His retreat is not peace, it is panic, because deep within he knows she saw what he hides even from himself. But she does not chase. She lets the silence stretch until it swallows the noise, until the absence becomes the teacher. Because the truth is, no woman destroys a man. His projections do. The collapse he blames on her is simply the implosion of his unintegrated shadow. She is only the mirror. He returns as they always do, with softer words, trembling eyes, the scent of regret clinging to his voice. He speaks of love, of fate, of misunderstanding. But behind it is still the same hunger, the wish to be seen as perfect, even in repentance. The dark feminine does not soothe. She observes. Her eyes hold the same still fire that undid him before, not to punish but to remind. Love cannot reach where ego defends. So she watches as he oscillates pride, shame, longing, denial, the four winds of the unhealed masculine. And she knows that until he stops seeking her as reflection, he will never meet her as reality. You have known that temptation too, to soften, to explain, to rescue him from his own awakening. But mercy here is sabotage, because every time you fill his silence with understanding, you shield him from his shadow. Let him descend. Let him confront what he calls you, only to find himself, because love without truth is possession wearing perfume. The ego resists what would make it whole. It calls freedom cruelty and accountability coldness. But what the ego calls loss, the soul calls remembering. He will try to replace her, to find the same fire in easier flames. But illusion tastes sweet only until silence is tasted. And silence, once known, haunts every superficial touch thereafter. It is not her absence that hurts him. It is the echo of himself he can no longer project. The wound now speaks his name, not hers. And beneath the ruin, awareness begins its quiet work. The anima stirs. The boy who sought control begins to see the man who could hold consciousness. Still, he resists. He grieves not her but the death of who he was with her, because she, unknowingly or not, performed the sacred violence of truth. And truth, once revealed, cannot be unseen. He stands at the threshold of his own making. The woman is gone, but her silence lingers like scripture. Every time he reaches for distraction, it whispers, "This is not hunger, this is avoidance." And somewhere deep within, where the fire first met the shadow, he begins to understand. She was never the lesson, he was. He dreams of her sometimes, not her body, not her voice, but the feeling of standing before her silence. The way it stripped him of language, of defense, of the fragile scaffolding he called self. In the dream, he reaches for her but touches air. And yet, that absence feels more alive than any embrace he's known. Because absence, once sanctified, becomes initiation. He no longer blames her, not because. See, he forgives, but because blame itself dissolves when one begins to see. What he called betrayal was reflection. What he called loss was awakening. And what he called love was often only his need to be mirrored by something powerful enough to quiet his fear. The fear of insignificance. The terror of seeing himself without adoration. That is the shadow hunger, the ache of an ego starving for its own reflection, mistaking pain for proof of depth. In his solitude, he begins to hear the faint hum of something deeper, the anima speaking, not as fantasy but as memory. The inner feminine he once sought in others begins to rise from within, soft yet commanding. It does not comfort him, it corrects him. He begins to realize that the feminine he worshipped and feared was never hers to give. It was his to reclaim. The tenderness, the intuition, the emotional sovereignty he once externalized, they were fragments of his own soul, buried under conquest and performance. He sees now how he loved women not for who they were, but for what they allowed him to forget about himself. Every devotion was a distraction. Every chase was a prayer for self-escape. But now there is no one left to project onto, only stillness, only the mirror turned inward. You know this space, the hollow between who you were and who you are becoming. It is not romantic, it is surgical. The stripping away of false identities until the raw psyche stands exposed. He feels it, the weight of awareness pressing against his chest, the collapse of meaning that once held him upright. The dark feminine has done her work. She has withdrawn the projection, and in that withdrawal, the ego dies its first small death. This is the alchemy Jung spoke of, the dissolving of the persona, the encounter with the unconscious, the descent into the underworld of the soul. The place where the hero stops slaying dragons and begins to meet the ones he birthed himself. He no longer dreams of conquering her. He dreams of understanding her, but she cannot be understood, only met, because she does not live outside him. She breathes within, waiting for recognition, not worship. And in that recognition, something ancient begins to move, humility. The sacred surrender of a man who no longer needs to dominate the unknown to feel safe. It is a quiet transformation, not the kind that makes him louder but the kind that makes him still. He stops chasing closure. He begins to listen. The hunger that once drove him to possess now drives him to perceive, to feel without controlling, to love without collapsing. That is how the dark feminine heals, not through affection but through annihilation. She dismantles illusion so truth can take its place. And when truth enters, hunger changes shape. He no longer desires to be adored. He desires to be real, to meet another without projection, without fear, without the performance of being deserving. He will not say this aloud. Transformation never announces itself. It moves through silence, through subtle choices, through the sudden comfort found in solitude. And when he meets another woman, perhaps years later, perhaps lifetimes, he will not chase her shadow. He will recognize her light, because the part of him that once needed to dominate has learned to witness. You see, that is the purpose of the dark feminine's cruelty. It is not cruelty at all. It is initiation by mirror. It teaches by absence, corrects by reflection, and liberates by refusal. The wound he once cursed becomes the altar where awareness kneels. He remembers her still, not with longing but with reverence, because she played the role the psyche required, the destroyer of illusion, the keeper of truth. But what he does not yet realize is that her power was never personal. She was the archetype wearing human skin, the goddess behind the gaze, the soul reminding him, nothing you seek in me can replace what you deny in yourself. He finally understands. The shadow was not his enemy, it was his teacher. And in that understanding, the hunger quiets, not because it is satisfied, but because it is seen. Silence returns, not the silence of rejection, but of completion. The mirror closes, the flame steadies, the man remains. He moves differently now, not with certainty, but with awareness, the kind of quiet presence that comes only after losing everything that was never his. His voice no longer seeks to impress, it seeks to align. There is still hunger, yes, but it no longer howls, it watches, it waits, it listens for truth before it reaches for touch. The old patterns still whisper, conquer, persuade, perform, but he no longer obeys, because he has met the echo of what follows obedience, emptiness. That sacred emptiness she left behind, the one that broke him open until he could finally see what he had been serving all along, not love, but image. He remembers her still, not as the woman who wounded him, but as the mirror that ended his pretending. Her silence was not cruelty, it was ceremony. Now he walks through his own psyche as though through ruins, temples built from ego, devotion sculpted from fear. Each fragment of stone tells a story of who he tried to be, and in the quiet light of awareness, he lets them fall. This is how integration begins, not through conquest but through witnessing. He sits with his shadow, no longer judging it as sin, no longer worshiping it as mystery, just seeing. The boy who feared irrelevance, the man who hid behind charm, the lover who called chaos connection. He sees them all, the masks, the hunger, the desperate reaching, and in that seeing something softens, not into weakness but into truth. That is when he understands the paradox. The feminine he feared was never a threat. She was the part of him that knew how to feel. For years he ran from her, in women, in silence, in control, because feeling meant surrender, and surrender felt like death. But death is what rebirth requires. Now when pain rises, he no longer seeks distraction. He breathes through it. He lets it teach him, because pain, when met without resistance, becomes presence. And presence, that is the true power. The one that cannot be taken, cannot be performed, cannot be faked. It is what remains when illusion burns. He begins to live from that place. Words fewer, energy clearer. He listens more than he speaks. He touches without taking. The dark feminine lingers, not as memory, but as state of being. She is the awareness behind his choices, the discernment in his desire, the fire that no longer destroys but purifies. You can feel it when you meet such a man, the stillness that unnerves you, the gaze that does not chase but perceives, the calm that holds no agenda. It is the quiet sovereignty of someone who has met the abyss and learned to stay. But this transformation does not belong to men alone. It mirrors in you as well, because the same pattern that made him chase reflection made you absorb projection. The same wound that made him dominate made you overgive. You too must integrate the shadow of your feminine, the one that confuses being chosen with being seen, devotion with worth, the one that calls tolerance strength and silence safety. the same silence that healed him will test you. Because to stand in your own stillness, you must stop performing care for the unready. You must let the hunger starve. There will be nights when you miss his chaos, not for the pleasure but for the noise. Because noise distracts from knowing, but knowing demands emptiness. So you sit in it, the quiet, the ache. The sharp clarity of seeing what you once called love was often self-abandonment dressed in poetry. And in that stillness, your own shadow rises, not as darkness but as authority, the part of you that no longer seeks to be understood because she understands herself. She becomes the throne. No longer the mirror, no longer the wound, no longer the rescuer. The throne still, sovereign, whole. When he returns, as the healed always do, he will not find the woman he left. He will find the woman who outgrew the need to prove her worth through pain. She will not punish him, she will not reward him, she will simply see him, and that seeing will be the final alchemy. Because power, once embodied, does not seek, it emanates. And in that silent exchange, the reformed man, the sovereign woman illusion ends. The hunger dissolves. The mirror closes, and only awareness remains. There is a moment when awareness becomes atmosphere. It stops being an insight and starts breathing through every gesture. He no longer analyzes his wounds, he carries them like relics of initiation. Each scar a scripture, each loss a teacher. He speaks less of what he feels because feeling has become his language. He no longer needs to prove transformation. It emanates from him quietly, like smoke from an extinguished flame. What once raged has refined into heat, steady, unassuming, enduring. He meets women now without the old trembling beneath his skin. Desire still stirs, but it no longer commands. It moves in rhythm with discernment, not desperation. Because when a man integrates his shadow, he stops seeking absolution through another's body. He begins to see connection as reflection, not redemption. He knows now that every woman he once loved was a mirror for the part of himself he refused to meet. The nurturing ones mirrored his need for safety. The chaotic ones mirrored his hunger for intensity. The silent one, she mirrored his forgotten depth. And when depth meets its own echo, it is never peaceful. It is purifying. You understand this. The shadow does not destroy, it reveals. It strips what pretends to be alive until only truth remains. That is why the path of awakening feels like loss, because everything false must first fall silent. He used to call that silence loneliness. Now he calls it alignment. There is a strange calm in R. Reaching a place where validation no longer tastes like nourishment, where praise feels foreign, and manipulation rings loud, where even love must pass through the filter of truth before it can be received. He walks with that clarity now. Each encounter becomes a test of vibration. He does not chase, does not cling. He observes who can hold the silence with him, because that is where real intimacy lives, in stillness unbroken by insecurity. She would recognize him now, though she would not need to. The lesson between them is complete. What began as projection has become integration. What once was hunger has become wholeness. He no longer fears the feminine. He reveres her within and without. He no longer divides her into angel or destroyer, muse or mystery. He sees her as consciousness in form, capable of both birth and annihilation, and that knowing humbles him. The anima within has awakened. No longer repressed, no longer projected, she speaks through his intuition, guides his timing, refines his strength. He learns that the masculine without the feminine is rigid. The feminine without the masculine is lost. But together, they are law and flow, direction and depth. That balance does not look romantic. It looks responsible. It looks like truth spoken without fear, boundaries held without anger, desire expressed without distortion. He begins to live as both the sword and the chalice, the clarity that cuts illusion and the space that receives what is real. And in you, too, something shifts. You no longer measure love by how much it consumes you. You measure it by how still you remain within it. You stop trying to be understood by those still addicted to misunderstanding themselves. You become quiet, not because you have nothing to say, but because silence has become your power. And when you meet his eyes, the one who once trembled before your distance, you will see it. The recognition that requires no words. The knowing that both of you have crossed the same fire and survived. He no longer needs your reflection to feel whole, and you no longer need his recognition to feel real. That is the mark of sovereignty, two souls who meet not to complete, but to mirror completion. There is no drama left to play, no redemption to perform, only presence, the kind that moves mountains without motion. And when he turns away, there is no ache, no longing, no residue, just stillness, the kind that follows a storm that has finally exhausted its need to prove its power. This is the end of projection, the end of hunger disguised as love, the end of illusion. What remains is truth, silent, sacred, unprovoked. The woman who knows her darkness no longer apologizes for the fire it brings.